My name is John Buchanan. I am Vice President of Sustainable Production at Conservation International. I've had the pleasure of working on these issues that we've been discussing this morning for almost 20 years, and much of that with many of you here in this room. And it's been a long road, and one of the things that has me so excited about the Good Growth Partnership is the message that you heard this morning, is that we have finally gotten past the debate where we were for far too many years, that it was either about conservation or about sustainable production or sustainable agriculture. And we are now at the place where we know these are the same debate, these are the same argument. We have to figure out, how do we do these issues together? If we want to sustainably manage forests, we have to help deal with poverty. If we want to address poverty in rural development, much of which depends on agriculture, most of which depends on agriculture, we need a healthy, thriving environment, because agriculture cannot succeed in a failing environment. If climate is changing, if water supplies fail, if there's landslides and mudslides. And so we really have to look at these two issues together. And that's, of course, what was the focus of our panel this morning, is how do you find that balance? How do we put those two together? And that's a big challenge. But we have another big challenge, because we know how to conserve forests, we know how to train farmers, we know how to strengthen enforcement of law. But our challenge is, how do we do that at scale? Because political systems, economic systems, social systems, those can take time to change. But ecological systems are not waiting for us. Climate change is marching on, whether we like it or not. And so we have to figure out, how do we address sustainable agriculture? How do we conserve forests quickly and at scale? We know, for example, that if you conserve tropical forests and restore tropical forests, that will contribute 30% of the emissions reductions we need to keep climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But we have to do that at large scale. And that's why the Good Growth Partnership is looking not only at working in supply countries and working with producers and governments, but also working with companies and working with the private sector and supply chain to figure out, how can we leverage global trade mechanisms? How can we take advantage of the global reach that today's global corporations have to try and drive change at larger scale and more quickly, to get the economic development and the poverty alleviation that we must have at a large scale, and to conserve the forests that we need at a large scale. So I'm very pleased to have a panel here that represents those two ends of the spectrum. And I would invite my panelists, please, to come up and join me on stage, because we have representing the demand side of the equation, if you will, is Rachael Sherman, right on cue. Rachael is the Director of Global Supply Chain Sustainability for McDonald's. Rachael is also the global palm oil lead for McDonald's. She's the lead for their, I noted you're a busy woman. You have global strategies for deforestation, water, climate change, and food waste. So just a few issues that Rachael is busy with. On the supply side, we have Fernando Lyrio, who is the Deputy Secretary of Biodiversity in the Ministry of Environment, and many years working on similar issues, has a master's in environment and development from the London School of Economics and Policy, and a chief advisor in the Brazilian government on the Rio Plus 20 conference. And we have Jason Clay, who's Senior Vice President for Markets at World Wildlife Fund, who's been a real thought leader and pioneer in this space for many years, and it's a pleasure to have you here as well. And Pak Rusman, if you would join us as well. We have Mr. Rusman Heriawan, who's the chair of the supervisory board. Sure, please. The chair of the supervisory board of the CPO fund within Indonesia. Pak Rusman was the vice chair for the vice minister of agriculture from 2011 to 2014. So again, brings many years of experience in dealing with these issues. And you see both ends on the supply side and the demand side of the challenge that we face today. And so I'm gonna kick it off the discussion with Rachael, but I also want to encourage, not only reiterate the point that Charlie made earlier about all of you participating. Ask some questions, send up your pieces of paper. But I'm also going to encourage my panelists to ask some questions of each other as we go along so we can have a lively discussion here. But Rachael, I want to start with you because we've worked with McDonald's for many years. You're a company that's been a leader in recognizing that you need a sustainable supply of raw materials if you want to have a stable business going forward. So you've done some amazing work in your own supply chain, but you guys have set an even higher bar, and you've been talking about getting other companies to follow suit. And could you tell us why, and more importantly, how do you go about that?
Sure, and thank you for having us here and inviting us to this forum. As you said, we have commitments on sustainable commodities at McDonald's globally, and we also have specific commitments and expectations around deforestation-free commodities with specific timelines. So by 2020, we have commitments on palm, soy, and beef, and we operate in 120 countries, thereabouts, globally. We're purchasing from countries around the world, and not only are we operating at scale and need to find solutions at scales, but we aren't producing any of these commodities ourselves. We cannot create these solutions on our own because we are not the ones producing the commodities. We work in partnership with our suppliers, many of whom are in the room here today. And for example, one commodity that we're focused on very much is beef. In beef alone, we're working across many countries for sustainable beef, for deforestation-free beef. If we wanted to have a fully traceable animal and purchase it and make claims around sustainability or deforestation-free, McDonald's, even as one of the world's largest beef consumers or buyers, does not purchase the entire animal. So we're purchasing trimmings, parts of the animal, and those are often the low-value parts of that animal. We need to work in partnership with other retailers who are purchasing maybe the higher-value cuts of meat. In addition, we have to do it in partnership with the producers of beef, for example. So in order to affect this change for any of the commodities that we have commitments on, we have to work in partnership with those who produce and supply those commodities that we serve to our customers.
How do you do that? Do you have any examples of how you've done that or where you've done that successfully?
Yeah, so one example that I visited recently, which I think is very exciting, is in the Amazon biome in Brazil. We previously had a commitment not to purchase any beef from the Amazon biome because of concerns around deforestation. And recently, we worked in partnership with the Novo Campo, or New Fields program there, operated by PEXA, which was started by a group of people who are local farmers, also worked at NGOs, producing sustainable and deforestation-free beef using production methods to increase productivity and yields on degraded lands. So lands that were already open a number of years ago, and working with local farmers to increase productivity there. And the way that we can participate in that is by buying that beef. So we came in as a purchaser of that beef in partnership with our supplier and served that beef at the Olympic Games in 2016 in Brazil. So that's an example of how it's small scale, but it's important because it proves that this can be a sustainable business for those farmers and that we can provide the market signal and serve this food to our customers.
So Fernando, you, in previous conversations, you mentioned the importance of the help of the private sector. And you have the challenge, and the government has the challenge of enforcing law. And you've noted the importance of the private sector in helping you do that. And if Rachael and McDonald's are successful in engaging their suppliers and getting other companies on board, what does that look like to you? What sort of help or input do you need from the private sector?
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity to exchange some views on these important issues, and it's really good for me to see that people from the environment and from the agricultural sides of the government are here talking together on these issues, and that's what we feel it's important. Most of the issues related to the environment in Brazil are being led now to non-environmental actors, so this is the great and change that we are seeing now, as you just mentioned in the beginning of the panel. And so many issues that are happening with the participation of the private sector in Brazil are actually not being with the leadership or with the initial participation of the government, which is a very good sign. For example, you can talk about the soy moratorium in Brazil. which was led by the private sector and by some organization from the civil society, where they decided that they wouldn't trade or produce soybean from the forested areas in Brazil. So now we can say that soya is not an important vector of deforestation in Brazil, and that was something that started with the participation of the private sector and some organizations from the civil society with the participation of the consumer side, and then later on the government engaged on the initiative, and then it had a role, but it was not initially part of the process. And the project that we are discussing here from this partnership, the government is not formally part of the project. We discussed it on the project, we are endorsing the project, but we are not formally part of the project. But the government has a very important role in this. And it's important that the government gives the right signs for the private sector, for the consumers, from the foreign governments, to what they are, how they are seeing the environment. I was just seeing Marcelo formally speaking in the other panel, what he's expecting from the government side. And he said, he didn't complain about the environment, which is really good. Normally, the agricultural side would be complaining about the environment side of the government, about being too demanding. He was basically saying that we need to show another image. We need to show the way that we are producing. And in that sense, what we are doing in Brazil, it's a very important achievement in terms of mapping the whole situation of land use for agriculture and cattle ranching in Brazil. So with the new legislation in Brazil, all landowners must register their lands and describe exactly where the lands are, what they are doing in the lands, and what are the legal reserves in the land, what are the permanent protected areas in these lands. With this, it's an unprecedented effort in the whole world. We have already something like 4 million properties registered, which amounts to more than 400 million hectares in the country, which is an enormous amount of land that is being mapped. And now you have to go through the next stage, which is validating this data. We have lots of data, you must validate. But once you have this, you have lots of information to offer to all sides. And then the private sector will have the precise information on where they are buying their products and what kind of production is being done in these lands, and if it's the forested area. Foreign governments will have the right information on where they are buying their imports, and the finance sector will have the right information on what kind of properties they must finance or not. So the government has a very important role, which is to induce and to provide information on what is being done in the rural properties, so that the private sector, financial sector, foreign governments must have exactly the right information on what's happening, and that would be an answer to the question that Marcelo was saying formally. We have to show that we have a new pattern, a new standard of production in terms of rural production.
But I think I also heard you mention there the finance sector, the production sector, foreign governments, and so that you're talking about bringing together multiple sectors together around this issue of legal compliance and sustainability, no?
Yeah. The government has, it's undeniable the convening power that the government has to put all these people together around this discussion. So this is a role that the government must have.
So that's a perfect segue to you, Pak Rusman, because you've been heavily involved in the Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil Initiative, and now the platform, this initiative, FOXP. Can you tell us Why was FOXP needed? FOXP is a platform. Why was it needed? Why did the Indonesian government feel you needed that platform?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, in September 2014, we signed a memorandum of understanding between the UNDP and our Ministry of Agriculture for sustainable palm oil initiative. Why we need the initiative for the sustainable palm oil? Because we realized before that the agencies, every agency or institution, even ministry, they were walking isolation. They work separately. They very less communication between them. Even they know, they understand, they believe that environment is our future. They concerned also about that, yeah. And then that is the reason why we need the initiative. In our long history of this initiative, later on we realized that we need kind of forum. We call the Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil Forum. Yeah. In Indonesian, we call the Forum Kelapa Sawit Berkelanjutan. Berkelanjutan is mean the sustainable. And this is a forum for multi-stakeholder based palm oil based multi-stakeholder. Yeah, we want to strengthen the collaboration between the multi-stakeholder and to invite their commitment to our mainstream for the environment, economic and social, something like this.
So what I'm hearing is, private sector clearly saying, Rachael, you're not speaking for all the private sector, sustainability is important for your company, and you need your peers to get on board with that. Government of Brazil saying we need the help of the private sector to support enforcement of their own law and to push the sector towards sustainability. Pak Rusman talking about these government-led platforms can help bring all those actors together.
Yeah.
That sounds hard.
Yes, too hard.
And
very hard.
And complex.
Yeah.
Jason, you've been beating your head against some of these walls for many years. How can this good growth partnership best address that challenge? And should we be looking that ambitious to bring together all these different actors?
Right. So I think I'd like to focus on the hard part of this challenge because I think we haven't really done too much on that yet. The premise here is that we can actually use the market to change the market and to change production. And that rests on a number of assumptions. One, we know where the markets are. Two, we know who are the big players in those markets. Three, we know what leverage points we have in each of those markets. And four, we know how to pull them. But I think the biggest thing we're discovering is that we're just not on the same page. So we have 44 definitions of deforestation commitments from companies. That doesn't help us. That actually makes things complicated. We haven't defined what deforestation is. So there are some things that we need to begin to do. And it's not just a market issue. It's also a policy issue. It's policies about zoning and land use planning and what we need to protect from a biodiversity and ecosystem service point of view, but it's also the enforcement of existing policies. A lot of the deforestation we care about is illegal. Let's call it what it is. How do we get rid of illegal deforestation in order to get to other more difficult questions about legal deforestation? So these are some of the things I think we need to focus on. It's also, we're looking at kind of one crop, one geography in production and maybe one or two geographies in consumption. The world doesn't work that way. So I know this is a pilot project, but this has special implications for kind of how we think about it. And in the meantime, we have climate change and all kinds of other things that are happening, global market shifts where North America and Europe don't dominate some of the markets we're talking about. And in some of these commodities, like beef, it's not globally traded very much from Brazil. It's more consumed domestically. So it's domestic markets we have to think about. But the bigger issue for me, and I heard Marcelo refer to it in his presentation, is that we want to work with the best producers and have the best knowledge and the best systems and the best this and then that. The problem is the issues that we care about are actually coming from the worst producers, not the best producers. And the bottom 25% of producers produce about 50% of the problems we care about. How do we move the bottom? What's the business case for moving the bottom? What's the business case for government to move the bottom? I think we've come to this issue from an environmental perspective. Deforestation is a problem, and we really need to fix it from a climate point of view, from an ecosystem service point of view, from a biodiversity point of view. But all of those of us who care about that aren't really the right people to figure out what the business case is. And that's where we're really lacking right now. That's where we're spinning our wheels, and we really have to develop that. And what are the alternatives? Where is the definitive work that shows that rehabilitation of degraded land is actually a much better, much more viable financial alternative for producers, for governments, for communities, etc.? And when we talk about finance for this work, can we shift from kind of business as usual assumptions about finance, working capital, longer term investments, etc., to what are the new business models we need in the 21st century? How will commodities be defined by traders in the 21st century, which include things like externalities, deforestation, child labor, etc., where that becomes part of what soy is defined as, what beef is defined as, what palm oil is defined as, or others. But I think the one thing that doesn't come out as much in all of these commodities as it does in a few of them, and that is what's the role of smallholders? And business as usual with that sector is just not going to work. Getting a 5% increase in productivity, a 2 or 3% or 5% increase in price is a joke. That is not enough to survive on. So how do we look at new business models? How do we actually think about joint ventures, ESOPs, other ways to create new assets for these groups, or else transfer them into another place where they can make a living better? But simply maintaining poverty shouldn't be our goal in any of this work around a lot of what we're talking about. So I'll stop there since there's probably enough to discuss now.
Great. So, Fernando, how does that strike you based on your experience in Brazil and that Jason's point about dealing with the smallholders and really it's not the top performing producers we care about, it's those bottom performers who are probably the most reluctant perhaps to engage in those discussions. Those are exactly the ones we need to get at. In your view in Brazil, this type of collaboration, these types of platforms, is that going to reach those? How do we get there?
Yes, definitely this is a great challenge. As great producers are much more concerned and much more conscious, and they have much more scale to do issues that they will be according to the market and to the demands of consumers. Small producers are a part of the problem that, and every time you try to reach them in either scale, the question is, where is the money, and show me the money, which are the incentives. And this is part of the implementation of the new legislation that we are having in Brazil. We are going through stages, and the next part is exactly that. What kind of incentive do I have to comply with the legislation, and what I'm going to gain with that? And if you don't have the right signs from the government in terms of, okay, it's good to produce this way, so you have difficulties in that. So when I was talking about the percentage of lands that were already registered in this new system in Brazil, of course, most of them comes from the large producers, and we're still having to organize and to convince some resistant parts of the small producers that are still reluctant about what's going to do what's going to be done with the citizens. Like we are creating a big brother that will be just know everything that they are doing in their lands, and it's just going to be used against them, not in favor of them. And so here it comes the convening power of the government, in the sense that you need to bring people to be part of the job, but then you have to, there it's coming, the role of the government together with the financial sector, and then we already having lots of financial sources that we're looking at so that we can offer, so that people can comply with the new legislation, so that people can organize their lands in terms of sustainability, in terms of declaration of the use. We are working together with civil society in terms of many representatives from other sectors. We are working with state sectors so that we can offer support to them, because most of the validation process and most of the experience in a large country like Brazil will be located in the states. And so if you don't work with the federal states, we will not have success. So all the next states will be like decentralization and supporting and local initiatives, and so that would be a way of reaching small producers together with local governments.
So looking at specific regions. Jason, you want to chime in on that?
So it's interesting. I mean, Brazil has linked credit to legality,
Yeah.
and made it so that you need to be a legal producer in compliance with CAR and have filed your documents. But I think we can take this one step further. We can actually try to give, if producers have a 10-year contract with McDonald's, can the government then, the BNDES or Bank of Brazil, actually give loans that are preferential to those groups to rehabilitate degraded land, to make investments in more climate-smart agriculture? Can we actually even reduce the cost or the interest rates of those loans if producers are building organic matter in the soil? Because that is actually a huge asset that they've got. So can we make finance climate smart? Can we make finance, which coming from government, because basically governments finance most of the productive stuff. Can we start thinking about how to do that and how to use the current market systems in trade and longer term contracts and other things to send signals that don't actually cost the companies any? They're going to buy these products anyway, but it lets the banks have an asset that's in hand with the producers that they can use to lend money.
Yeah, definitely this would be the kind of incentive that you might have, because if you just make the link between legal compliance and finance, okay, that's okay. You are complying and then you get, but then you need to provide the right incentive for those who go beyond the legislation.
Exactly.
And that's the great challenge. And those who will be doing more, those who will be producing organically, those who will be preserving more, will be, so that's the next step. And then we are already working, just mentioned the BNDES, which is the National Bank for Economic and Social Development. And then we are just to organize the way that we can organize finance in terms of giving the right signs for small producers.
Great. So continuing on that, there's some questions starting to come in from the floor. And again, I would encourage people send in thoughts, questions. And it relates to a bit the smallholder question and this is for you, Jason, as to how long, you mentioned transitioning away from the smallholder model at some point. How small is too small? How do we get away from that model?
Right.
How long do you think it'll take to transition away from that?
Every society is in the process of doing this everywhere in the world. I mean, there are fewer smallholders every year than the year before. If you look at it globally, this is happening. There are just no incentives. There's no focus on capacity to make the transition easier for some of those groups. And in fact, a vibrant rural economy can be organized in a way that actually generates a lot of jobs, that generates jobs that allows people to have a foot both in production and a foot in services or doing other things because there's increased productivity. But I think the one place where we've really failed is to look at new models of production. like employee stock option programs in rural areas where communities are joint venture partners in a palm oil plantation, where the community owns the land and part of the factory, not just the land and the production, so that they have access to and part of their assets are the value that's added to their production as it moves through the system. That's a type of system we can live with, and we can maintain more people on the land using those systems. But if we just allow efficiency to dominate the discussion, then these people are going to become much more marginal. Mm-hmm. And in tree crops, that's an interesting thing, because tree crops require a lot of labor, whether it's palm oil or cocoa or coffee or any of those kind of crops. We've got to find ways, I think, to make it more equitable.
Great. So Rachael, there's a question in here for you, and it relates to the Novo Campo example that you referred to before. And if I read this right, the question is, do you continue to source from the same farmers group? And I think that you're still buying from that. And the second part of that question, which is I think is also interesting, is have you replicated a similar approach in other supply chains in other regions? In other commodities.
So yes, we continue to buy from them. We have not replicated their approach because they are producing the commodities. So I just want to say again, we're not producing or supplying any of these products specifically, but we are looking at scaling this kind of approach in beef, in Brazil, in Paraguay, in other locations. And we're also working on this in palm oil, where we purchase from Indonesia, Malaysia, and in soy, which we are less directly engaged with. So there are pilot projects that we are involved in. For example, in North America, we're partnering with a group to invest in sustainable beef, specifically pasture management, and looking at how we can first prove the concept and then bring it to scale. And I think for McDonald's, that's going to be the critical part.
How can governments help you with that scaling effort? And period. And I'm going to follow up on that.
So there's different ways. I think participating in industry groups such as the roundtables on sustainable beef is incredibly important, and we see governments getting involved in many places, including in Canada, in Brazil, and so on. There's also often funding opportunities that we encourage our suppliers or we directly can participate in. For example, matching funds, and we've done that in coffee, for example. I know the Inter-American Development Bank had matching fund programs for sustainable coffee initiatives that we, in partnership with our suppliers, took advantage of. So I think that there's different ways that governments can engage, and all of the things we've talked about, legislation, traceability, creating an equal playing field by shared definitions and KPIs will make it easier for us to do this at scale with our peer companies.
So one of the products from the Foxby platform that Pak Rusman helped set up is this National Action Plan for Sustainable Palm Oil. And is that something that a company like McDonald's would get behind and support that? And how would you do that? And how would that help you?
So we're less of a large player in palm than we are in something like beef. So we may not play as active a role in palm oil, but we do encourage our suppliers to do so. And not only do we encourage them to do so, we require them to do so if they want to supply to us. So for example, we conducted an RFP over the last year globally, where we analyzed all of our suppliers on certain criteria, such as, are you involved in government or in supporting government initiatives or innovative sustainability programs in your commodity? And companies that could not prove to us that they have those abilities will not continue to supply to us, or we will work in partnership with them to create opportunities for them to be engaged in things like that. Mm-hmm. Use greater resources or things like that.
Pak Rusman, with that, how would you, what would you like to see more of in the private sector in supporting your National Action Plan?
Yeah, we just convinced our colleague here that we have the same vision about the sustainable commodities. Yeah. At least for McDonald's, for example, they still use the palm oil. It's great for us, good news for us, yeah. Especially in Indonesia, of course. And then to make the forum, as I mentioned before, working well, So we need tools, how to perform the forum can work. And then we to formulate the National Action Plan. The National Action Plan is now we have 4 working groups. Involving different ministries, different institutions, NGO, to work together, discuss about what detail of the National Action Plan will be formulated. Now we are in the final step, to realize the official document on this National Action Plan. At least we have 4 interesting components in the National Action Plan. One is the capacity building for smallholder. The interest issue for the capacity building for smallholder is replanting, because most of them, the smallholder, the age of the trees they own is about 25 up to 30 years. The trees, palm oil trees, it's not going to be benefited them anymore. So should be replanting. Problem is they don't have any financial support. In 2015, for example, 7 ministers agreed to establish, we call the CPO Fund Agency. One of the very good mission for this agency is to accelerate and to support replanting program. Because in the replanting program, there are a lot of dimensions there. One is how to increase the productivity of the smallholder. The palm oil owned by smallholder, only 2 tons per hectare a year in the average, compared to the average, national average, 5 tons per hectare, almost double. So through the replanting, we want to increase their productivity and also to support the Indonesian sustainable palm oil.
So clear opportunity there for private sector to support the smallholders with replanting. There was a related question on smallholders, if I could continue on that theme. We've talked a lot about smallholders and the challenges. We've talked about technology and innovation. And there's a question there's new technologies, there's disruptive technologies coming into the agriculture sector. And this is a question for anyone on the panel. Which of those technologies will help smallholders? Some of them might displace smallholders. Which technologies can best help smallholders? Anybody who wants to take that?
Definitely ones that reduce the susceptibility of their production to diseases or drought, etc. But I think they're never going to be as benefited as some of the larger, more efficient producers are. I think the technologies that are going to benefit them most are maybe around the business models themselves and how you change those, how you break out of a model that's about 100 years old and see if there's another way to organize business on the ground. And I think the one thing that hasn't come up yet today that maybe we should put on the table at least is that climate change is going to change where we produce commodities and how we produce commodities. And I think that means that we have a very static approach to how we're thinking about this right now that needs to maybe change. Because climate change is going to cause, literally, in the case of deforestation, the cutting edge to move into new places that are better suited. But there's going to be the other side, which is going to come out of production, where we need to focus just as much attention on what's the next crop for those guys to produce as well. So as we move away from an area, we've got the laggards that are still in that, still producing or producing less efficiently every year. How do we get them into something else that's better more quickly? Yep. So these are things where we just have to be thinking a little more systemically, I think, than we are.
Great. Well, thanks, Jason, and thanks to our whole panelists. I've been told we need to wrap up, but I think that was that last point was a good one in terms of the innovation. So we'd said before, and what we heard out of this panel is we clearly need active engagement of government, but we also need the private sector working in partnership. And one of the mechanisms to bring those together is through some of these dialogue platforms. And I'd said earlier, one of our challenges is to use those different elements to scale. But I think we heard coming out of the discussion that it isn't just about scaling and systemic change, it's also about the innovation that needs to be part of that, because as we heard earlier, there is no one model. Ibu mentioned that earlier, there is no one model for sustainability, and we need to continue that innovation. And I would argue it's through these same types of dialogue platforms and engagements, initiatives like the Good Growth Partnership, I think we can create those laboratories for innovation by working up and down that value chain and across the landscape, as you just mentioned, Jason. So thanks again to my panelists, thanks to the audience, and thanks for the questions from the floor. And